Welcome to the Notes to My Legal Self AI Insights, where law and AI collide. Get ready to level up your legal game with us. We've got career advice, cutting edge developments, mind blowing legal tech, and more. Know someone making waves in the legal AI world? Nominate them, or even nominate yourself. We love courageous souls. And don't forget, we want to hear from you too. Ask questions, drop comments. Let's build a community of legal superheroes. But here's the deal. We're all about to have a blast. AI may be serious, but we're here to make it fun. So buckle up, get ready to power up, and let's embark on this exciting journey together. Now, let's introduce your fearless host, Olga Mack. Get ready to dive into the awesomeness of Notes to My Legal Self AI Insights. Let's go.
Well, let's go. We will do. I am so excited about this conversation. I met Professor Schwartz earlier this year, a few months ago, in person at Codex event, and had really great conversation. And thought to myself, "Oh boy, this conversation cannot stay private. It absolutely needs to be shared because I would like for folks to see it, ask questions, get in touch with Professor Schwartz, and really start thinking about." What are the use cases with this amazing Gen AI technology that we are experiencing? We're in the middle of this massive evolution, revolution, whatever you perceive it to be, and it is an exciting place. And we have this exciting tool. And the question is, how do we use it and what do we do with it? The most important question of the day, the question that people ask me all the time, and I'm sure Professor Schwartz, welcome to Notes to My Legal Self. Really excited to have this conversation for everyone to see. For people who have not met you in person like I have, please introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School. And a lot of my work early on and still to this day focuses on insurance law and regulation. But in recent years, I've really started focusing a lot of my work on AI and the impact that Gen AI in particular is going to have on the legal field. And so that's how we met, and that's what I'm here to talk about.
It's really funny. We also have a shared passion about insurance. I'm curious, shift from insurance to AI, is that a shift or is it sort of continuation of the same interest? I'm just curious how those two for you add up together because in my mind they really do add up together. I see insurance as a financial instrument which is already unapproachable, wrapped up in legalese, which basically makes it incredibly unapproachable. So I see AI tools as something that is really helpful in approaching something that is entirely unapproachable. But I'm curious, how did that research evolution?
Yeah, well, look, AI insurers have been pretty early adopters in AI, and part of that is one of the big, elements of the business of insurance is prediction, right? Insurers have to predict claims, they have to predict losses, they have to predict fraud, they have to predict when people are going to make claims so that they can be sure to have enough money to pay. They have to predict future natural disasters. So there's an immense need for prediction in the business of insurance, and of course the sort of non-gen AI machine learning. That's what it was all about. It's about predicting, and so the tools that AI made available in that regard were very early on adopted by insurers, but then at the same time, insurers had to worry about a lot of the potential downsides of machine learning AI, just in the predictive sense, whether that's unfair discrimination, because insurers are statutorily prohibited from relying on certain characteristics to predict claims, whether that's potential unfair bias, whether that's opacity, whether that's, model drift. All of these issues have been around for some time in the insurance sphere. So I've been thinking about AI in that context for some time regarding what types of uses of AI raise unfair discrimination questions. And then when sort of Gen AI hit the scene, and for me, it really was when ChatGPT came out. I had no prior sort of experience with Gen AI. But at that time, one of my colleagues at the time, who's regrettably moved on to sunnier places, John Choi, got me really interested in it. And we worked together along with several other colleagues on a paper, ChatGPT Goes to Law School, looking at essentially what happens if you give law school exams to ChatGPT. And from there, I've just been really fascinated, sort of continually marveled at technology and at its capacity to impact what lawyers do. And so I'm wanting to continue working on it. But I'm still doing insurance as well.
I love it. Okay, yeah, I think insurance, especially if you're on the geeky side of law, is an incredibly hard discipline to leave. Let me ask you this: before you become professor, before you were interested in the, insurance and Gen AI application for lawyers, what happened? How did you then get up in the morning and said, I know what I'm gonna be doing. I know exactly what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna study insurance and then AI.
Well, when I was in law school, I really I loved law school, and I was really interested in becoming a law professor just because I was fascinated by what I was studying. And I also, frankly, I don't always deal well with authority and having people tell me what to do. So the idea of being able to think for myself what I wanted to do and not have anyone who's telling me really appealed to me. And I also really like teaching and sort of, performing in front of groups. So I was very interested in becoming a legal academic in law school, but I had no sense that insurance was the thing for me. I clerked for a year on the First Circuit Court of Appeals, and then I went to work at a law firm at Ropes and Gray. And I just randomly was assigned to the insurance department at Ropes and Gray, and I worked for a partner whose main client was Lloyd's of London. And so during that time period, I really got exposed to a lot of really interesting litigation, really interesting issues, whether it was the question of whether or not the attacks on the World Trade Center were one occurrence or two occurrences, a question that ended up being a multi-billion-dollar question, or whether it was Elliot Spitzer's investigation of these prominent insurance brokers who had been fabricating bids. So it was sort of a very hot time for insurance. And I thought, gee, this is super important. This really matters a lot to everything lawyers are doing. And I had never heard anything about insurance in law school. I thought, well, gee, there's a real opportunity here to work in a field that matters to lawyers and that has a real practical effect on the world, but is maybe not the sexiest topic in the world, and so doesn't draw as much attention as it might otherwise in law school. And that appeals to me. And maybe it's why I'm interested in AI as well. I'm interested in studying areas of the law that matter, that have a practical effect on the world. And so, insurance was a natural fit, and that's how things evolved.
Yeah, insurance. I mean, Lloyd's of London is arguably the name in insurance, and the time to litigate was post 9/11. That is it. So it's really interesting. It's one of those industries that is incredibly important. A lot of things in business, nonprofits would not be happening. Events if they were not insured. It's one of those things that we completely don't appreciate fully to what extent the things that are not insurable really affect our life, and our relationship with insurance to this day is still very much in prehistoric ages. I do want to focus on Gen AI use cases, and I know you've done a lot of research, and I'm just curious, in your tell me a little bit more about your research, I guess, as sort of to frame the conversation. And then as a next matter, I do want to talk about what it is that you're finding that how those tools could be useful for lawyers.
Yeah. So I've done a number of different studies looking at the impact of Gen AI on lawyering. I alluded to one earlier where we were just looking at how the sort of first version of ChatGPT could perform on law school exams. And that study sort of got a lot of traction because it was early on. But since then, I've done a number of studies that really try to get at not just the question of what happens if you feed ChatGPT a legal question, but instead the more, I think, realistic and important question of what happens if you give human lawyers access to these products and these technologies. How does it affect lawyering? And so, in one paper, we looked at in the context of law school exams, what happens if you have students who have access to GPT-4 versus those who don't. And we found that there was a significant improvement among students who didn't perform as well without GPT-4, but that actually for the highest performing students, there was some evidence that actually giving them access to GPT-4 potentially reduced their overall success just in terms of the quality of their work product. And we can talk more about that. That was sort of a incidental finding, and there was less data behind it, but I still think it was notable. And that's sort of broadly consistent, I would say, with the literature that's out there, that access to AI is particularly important for folks who have less experience, who are less well trained than it is for folks who are really already sort of at the top of their game. We then did a second study, and I think to me this is the most relevant study we did, where we did a randomized controlled trial where we were looking at real learning tasks. We were looking at the production of a legal memo, of a contract, of an employee handbook, of a complaint. And again, we split up law students into two groups. We gave one group access to GPT-4. The other one did not have access to GPT-4, at least for each task. We varied that. And we found that in general, there wasn't a big improvement in quality with access to GPT-4, but there was a massive and consistent improvement in the speed and efficiency with which our participants, at least, were able to complete the tasks. And so at the end of the day, the sort of broader picture was, well, look, this is a technology, just GPT-4, where it's improving efficiency by, something in the order of 30, 40, 50% without any degradation in quality on average. And so, that's sort of the research that's out there. And that particular piece is called Lawyering in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. It's forthcoming in the Minnesota Law Review, and it's with John Choi and Amy Monahan. And I have other experiments in the work. I mean, for me, understanding all the different variables and all the different ways in which this technology can change learning, will change learning, is, of first order importance for our field. And I'm always surprised at how few people are doing this work, and so I'm just continuing to press forward.
Yeah, I really love it. I actually have a few questions. Let me ask sort of as a basic. You and a few folks in the field now refer to human lawyering. Presumably we're lawyers, like, that's something we have not done in the past, presumably because we are expecting other form of life on earth when it comes to lawyering.
The
Help me
dog lawyering, right?
yeah, because this is the term that I now have seen in a lot of literature, and and I'm assuming this is not just us living the sci-fi, period of our life. How is this an important distinction? Should the ABA be putting that distinction in its model code? Like, I'm just curious about this term human lawyers, because, practically speaking, that's all we have today in the world observable.
I mean, I think increasingly that there's the potential to have certain AIs that can perform the entirety of legal advice and tasks without any human in the loop. I mean, in theory, GPT-4 can do that right now. You ask it a legal question, it tell you it's not a lawyer, and then it will give you a legal answer. And I certainly think that with certain agentic capabilities, that's going to become more true. There are going to be tools out there that do this, and so I do think it's really important. And the way that I would distinguish sort of human lawyering from non-human lawyering is there a human in the loop, right? And that in the loop phrase is very in vogue. But if there's some human that is checking the work, that is communicating it, that's ultimately in charge, I would say that is human lawyering, right? Humans using this as a tool. But I do think that there is the real capacity, at least in some contexts, for these tools to essentially perform the tasks that lawyers could perform without any human intermediation at all. I have another project where I'm looking at that particular question empirically. And so I think we're going to need to think about when we're going to allow that, what types of licensing requirements we're going to have, how we're going to make sure that they perform as well or better as human lawyers. But at the end of the day, lawyering is incredibly expensive. There's an incredible need for lawyering skills, and I think that if we can automate certain elements of lawyering, that is to the benefit of everyone. So I do think we need to think about that seriously.
Okay, and so the terminology we're using and how we're describing, and it is evolving with the technology. One of the things you mentioned is that using Gen AI makes a massive difference. Is especially if you are on the junior side, meaning you either junior because you just recently graduated from, say, law school, or because it's a new area of the law. I mean, we could be, as an in-house practitioner, I was junior in many things, including, for example, things like insurance law. Every time I would read it with my new eyes, because I was not an insurance litigator or a practitioner in any way, would make a reasonable prediction of what all of that means. And then a practitioner would point out to me that all my reasonable predictions actually entirely unreasonable in this context. And insurance actually has its entire new way of thinking about the world. So I'm an amateur when it comes to insurance law every time to this day. And so your your assertion that this is where technology can make a big difference for a junior lawyer, somebody who is trying to put their head around a new area of law that they're encountering in the wild. This is where it's helpful. It's not going to sacrifice the quality given that you're starting in the beginning, and it's going to be very helpful to bring you up to speed. Let's talk about it. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so the first thing I should say is I still think like there's a lot of evidence that needs to be gathered, right? Like I think that there's some evidence that's out there. I've helped develop some of that evidence, but I think there's so many variables at play that it's dangerous to sort of start generalizing about like this is exactly where it's most helpful. This is where it's least helpful because there's change in the underlying technology. There's what technologies you're using. There's what types of tasks you're using. There's what type of stakes that are issue. But putting that to one side for the moment, at least in our particular studies, we did find that the improvement in quality in particular was very unevenly distributed based upon your baseline skills. And so for the students who were not performing as well, just sort of asking them to do certain legal tasks, giving them AI made a really big difference. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. But I think one of the really big reasons is that, in a sense, there's more room for improvement, right? It's very intuitive, right? Like if you're not very good at something, then there's a lot of room for improvement.
I mean, you can't get worse than being a beginner.
Right, exactly. And this is really a result that's pretty robust across sectors. So there's some prominent research that's been done in sort of the customer service space that shows if you give an AI agent to new customer service agents, it makes a big difference in terms of how quickly and how well they resolve customer complaints and customer questions. Whereas you don't really see that same level of improvement for more experienced, more successful customer service agents. So I think that really is part of it. It's just like, what's the baseline? I also think that there's a sense in which, look, the way these tools work in a very broad brush stroke is like they average out everything that they're trained on, right? And so, and they give you a relatively good version of the average. And so, what that means is that at the end of the day, they're giving you pretty good results, but they're not necessarily, positioned to always know what is the best possible result, right? They average out sort of all the data and then they have some reinforcement learning with human feedback and then there's some prompting, whatever else. But at least as of right now, some versions of this technology, and that is, I think, changing, are not necessarily optimized to give you the best possible answer. And, there's some prompting tricks out there. There's some technology that's increasingly trying to fine tune it in that way. And so I think that's part of it as well. The other thing, just to say, and I think I had alluded to this earlier, is I think there's some risks out there for people who are very experienced with relying on this technology. So it's sometimes referred to as like falling asleep at the wheel. But the idea is, look, if you have a computer that's doing something reasonably well, but you're very good if you spend a lot of time on it, you're just going to sort of not question it as much. And so if you're independently thinking about something, maybe you're going to see issues that the computer doesn't see. But given that the computer is spitting something out quickly, you'll sort of just rely on it. So I think it has this equalizing force, at least potentially. Now, I guess the one thing I'd want to caution for is like, I don't always think this is true. So for instance, one of the best use cases for AI in law, I think, is for experts. And the reason for that is, at least in some contexts, because experts can tell right away whether or not what they're getting back is really good. And they can say, that's a hallucination. I can ignore that. Or no, I know that that's true. I just needed it to be written down in an eloquent way. This is great. And so a lot of it is super context dependent. In the context of our experiments, when we were using GPT-4, and this was, however many months ago, that version of GPT-4, not Omni, and what we weren't using specialized retrieval augmented generation, and we were using law students who didn't have a lot of training, and we were asking them to do certain tasks, we did see this distribution. But I think that in other contexts with other types of experiments, we might have seen it in terms of, for instance, how often are there hallucinations and how often are hallucinations potentially, messing up your results, you might have seen the opposite results. So I do caution it's important to be context dependent here.
I definitely want to talk about risk, but I still want to talk about sort of benefits and applications. I love this sort of it's very good at basically bringing everyone on a normal curve in the 80 percentile, like really good to be normal. And there's something, when you are in the beginning, it's good to become normal. And then I think what you're saying, it's really hard to become excellent. But then, a second use case is if you're excellent, then if you actually give it, substantive stuff, it's really good at building on top of it. And I've certainly experienced it. And it just polishes it and gets it sooner across the line and actually allows you to have insights. What other benefits and use cases do you see? Maybe you haven't researched it, but you're sort of hypothesizing or seeing in the wild as really good use cases for this technology in law.
I think there's so many, and I think this is one of those areas where we're constantly learning, and also the answer is constantly changing because the underlying technology is changing. Let me just give you a few. Okay, it's very clear that it's quite good at summarizing, right? So you want to summarize a deposition, you want to summarize a case. It's pretty good at that. Now, that's going to be more valuable if, for instance, you don't need every detail. It's going to be more valuable if it's okay if there are slight mistakes, right? It's going to be more valuable if you know the case, and so you can tell whether the summary is good, right? If you know a case, you've read it before, and you need a summary of it, perfect, right? Throw it into GPT-4, have it summarize it, and then you'll be able to say, oh, well, you didn't include that bit that I remember, or this looks pretty good, but let's take out that piece. Less good if it's really an important case and you're not familiar with it. Same type of thing with I work in insurance law, of course, right? Like I've described adverse selection and moral hazard 1,000 times, and I'm tired of writing explanations of it, and there are tons of things like that all the time when I have to write things I know the back
And
of my.
there's things that I've written, and I actually trained, my GPTs to think like Olga because I've written for the last 20 years. I've had all the articles I
Yeah.
have written, and I've written about the same things just in different contexts many, many times. I want to make sure I'm one consistent, but two, I will say, listen, describe this in the different context, and it will say basically what I would eventually say. It just would take me a long time polishing it.
And right when you read it, this is good or this is not good.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like
Right,
me.
exactly. So that's, I think, a really important use case. I think another really important use case is helping to brainstorm. So I used to teach contract law, and sometimes I still teach contract law and contract drafting. It's really good at saying, okay, hey, here's a contract. Think about clauses I'm missing. Think about potential ambiguities. And that's something that's very hard for lawyers to see an ambiguity until it's pointed out to them. Think about potential ways to make this more buyer friendly, seller friendly. It's excellent to that because, again, you have, as an experienced lawyer, a capacity. Yeah, that is an ambiguity, or no, that's not an ambiguity, or yeah, that would make it more favorable, or yeah, I don't need to address that issue. And so that is a very valuable use case. It's very valuable for querying for legal research, right? I mean, some of the tools that are out there, there are varying qualities that are out there, but if you want to get just a very quick hey, what are the most important cases, give me a summary, you're using retrieval augmented generation, you're using one of the tools that are sort of optimized for this. And in my experience, the two best I've seen are CoCounsel and Vincent, and you're using those tools. They can get you legal memos that are basically as good as what young associate can do, and they can do it virtually instantaneously at zero cost. Now, you have to check them, but they make it easy, right? They give you the underlying case, they'll show you the underlying citations and the underlying text. So that's a really valuable tool because the ability to check is baked right in, and again, an experienced lawyer is going to know whether or not there's something in that memo that seems fishy and say, well, I want to ask follow-up questions, or I want to look at that case or not. So those are just some examples, but I think that, look, every lawyer's practice is distinct, and every the types of tasks they do, the types of things they need help with, the types of things and so I think for every lawyer, it's going to be different. And that's why I think every lawyer should be experimenting with this. I know for me, I use these tools in probably 50 or 60 different ways. and it substantially enhances my capacity to do my work, and it also gives me more free time. I mean, like, honestly, like, I work less hard than I used to work, and I produce more. And I don't think that the quality is suffering. I think if anything, it's improving. And that's a pretty nice position to be in. And I wish more people were. Here's another example. I really like this example. I used to write pretty slowly and be very deliberate about exactly how I would write. And it would take me forever to craft the perfect paragraph. And like then I'd finally get it and I'd review it. Now what I do is I write incredibly quickly. And then I take what I write and I plug it into GB4 and I say, you are writing for whatever, law review, streamline this, make it more precise, and suggest edits. I get the edits, and then I just treat it as, okay, here's a really good editor who is basically giving me suggestions. And that process is, I write so much faster than I used to write. And the result is just as good, because at the end of the day, I'm making the decisions. At the end of the day, I'm the one guiding the text, but it's just serving as an editor. And because I write at high volume, that's incredibly valuable to me. Now, I'm not going to use that for everything. If I need to craft the perfect paragraph that's going to be read by everyone in the world, I might not use it that way. But law review articles are long. You've got to crank out pages, and I know exactly what I wanted to say in many contexts, and so it's a wonderful tool in that setting, even though it might not be wonderful if I were writing, like, say, a New York Times op-ed.
Yeah, and that's definitely really good for taking your thoughts and kind of helping you think through other ways and kind of cranking out more precise and getting to there much sooner. I want to talk a little bit about risks because there's definitely benefits. It saves time, it creates efficiencies. You are no longer sort of editing and maybe proofreading and doing all that, and you are working not with the first draft, but you're working with the second and third and fifth draft. So there are all of those things that are sort of really helpful, and I find also actually kind of help me find other intersections and ideas, really kind of actually challenge of things that would take me a long time to reach by myself. But there are of course risks, and you mentioned some of them. We've now discussed hallucinations in many ways, and folks are very well aware of those, especially because of various cases like Avianca and a few other places. But I'm just curious, aside from the obvious hallucination stuff, what are the other risks? What are the risks of using this technology?
So one of the things we saw for sure in one of our studies was that for higher performing students, it could tend to crowd out independent thinking. So if you're a lawyer and you're confronting a new issue, you're doing a lot of issue spotting, and part of the process of thinking through an issue is writing it out, right? And I know this for me, right? Like, I see an issue, I see a new thing. My best way to really understand it is to write it down. And as I'm writing it, I realize that it's not as I don't have as precise a grip as I want, or I realize there are counter arguments. That writing process is thinking. And if you're relying on this technology to write your first draft, that means that you're actually skipping over some of that thinking that might have taken you in a different direction, that might have shown you different angles, that might have shown you counter arguments, that might have shown you different rules that might apply. And so that to me is a very big risk in some contexts. Again, it's going to matter more in some contexts than other contexts. If it's the type of issue you're really familiar with, where you know the issues, you don't need to worry about that. If it's but if you're talking about, like, say, the context of an exam, right, where you have a complex fact pattern, you're trying to spot issues, you're trying to see counter arguments, you're trying to just plugging it into GPT-4 and then sort of messing around with it, that's a really big risk. I think that's underappreciated. I think it's also just there are ways in which it can make it harder to organize your thoughts. Again, part of writing is thinking. Writing is also organizing. A lot of what I do when I write is, okay, well, does this belong here? Does this belong here? Is this 3 points? Is this actually 2 points each with the two underlying subpoints? Where does the little a go? Where does the little two go? Whatever else. It's very easy to default to whatever the organization the AI gives you, especially if you're using it as the first draft. So one of the things I try to tell people, and I have this sort of saying that I've repeated before, but I think it's useful, is that in a lot of contexts, not always, but in a lot of contexts, you want to use GPT-4 to help you produce a second draft. And the idea that you use it to produce a first draft and then you work on it, that is dangerous because it can give you tunnel vision and it can short circuit the thinking process. So that's one really big risk.
Even if that first draft is basically just a vomit of thoughts,
Yeah.
right? I think I agree with you. You otherwise I think you the term you use defaulting to an average and crowding out the original thoughts.
Yeah.
But it is really good at making inferences too. So that if you give it a baseline of your thoughts, one, I think I find it very useful to actually ask which of those thoughts are original.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's really good at pointing that out. And then the other thing I love asking is kind of what other intersections that I should be exploring that are maybe not as obvious. And then after you form that, then you ask it to actually give you an okay second draft. Then it does a much better. And I think you sort of avoid this falling asleep behind the wheel type of experience,
Yeah.
and crowding out the independent thoughts. Um, Believe it or not, we are coming to the end. And I have a few more questions. I definitely want to talk about sort of strategies. You mentioned sort of experimentation, that all lawyers should be adapting this is almost entrepreneurial approach to your legal practice, and kind of thinking through the value of your time and what this tool is good for. The kind of thing that I normally do, I'm a trained artist. So I like new tools because it gives me an ability to kind of figure out how that tool works. Is it part of my repertoire of things, and how to use it and under what circumstances? Lawyers historically don't need to do that. We have a set of tools, we
Right.
have our bench, we show up and we kind of deliver technically what we need to be delivering. And when you talk about experimentation, that is much more akin to what an artist would do in a new medium, or entrepreneur would do with new technology to kind of find opportunity. And that's a very different skill than we teach in law school. So my question to you is, what strategies should lawyers be considering as they are sort of playing with this technology, experimenting with technology, understanding that the skills that they may need to have to succeed in this adventure are not taught in law school. They're much closer to what entrepreneurs or artists would do, which is very much in our United States legal education, trying to get you away from those sort of practices and approaches.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that lawyers and firms need to adopt a sort of method of experimentation, evaluation, and then repeat. And so that needs to occur both at the individual lawyer level, at the firm level, at the client level. You need to be experimenting across a lot of different types of dimensions because there's so many variables, right? There are obviously different base models, right? Whether you call it Gemini or GPT-4 or GPT-4 Omni or GPT-5, which may come out any day now, right? There are obviously different systems built on top of that, whether it's Lexis or Westlaw or Vincent or CoCounsel or what have you. There are variables in terms of what types of lawyers you're giving access to this. Are you giving to junior associates? Are you giving to paralegals? Are you giving it to partners? There are variables in terms of have you had training beforehand, right? One of the things we did is we gave training to students before they used it so that they had some experience with it. And even then, we saw big improvements over time as in several of our studies in terms of the comfort that people had with it. There's experimentation in terms of the types of tasks, which is absolutely vital, in terms of the stakes of the tasks, in terms of the importance of how quickly you deliver. And all of this is changing, and there's variables in terms of clients' receptivity to this. And so, to my mind, there's so many variables that impact the extent to which this technology can make a difference and the ways in which it can make a difference. And they're so constantly changing, and the potential for this technology to fundamentally change different elements at different times is so obvious in my mind, I think in a lot of people's minds, that it's almost incumbent upon every individual lawyer and every individual firm to be constantly reevaluating, to have a committee that's set up to constantly set up experiments, to have individuals. I've heard someone say this, and I really like it. Have a sticky pad on your computer that says, "Can GPT-4 help me with that?" Right? Or for me, I always just have GPT-4 open in a browser, and it just reminds me at any point I can ask that question or I can try it. And sometimes it doesn't work, right? Sometimes like, oh gee, no, this is not very helpful here. Like I should just write this myself. Or and sometimes it's like just amazing. Or I find different, use cases. The variety of things that it can do, whether it's help create charts for me, help analyze data, help me think of questions, help me summarize things, help me edit things, help me understand concepts. I sometimes use it as a thesaurus. It's great as a thesaurus, way better than the thesaurus that's built into Microsoft Word. So there's just almost an infinite set of things that it potentially could be useful for you, and you're never going to find it out until you experiment, and then the results of that experiment may change over time. And if you're not doing those experiments, you're missing out.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. My version of a sticky note, I have a default browser that pops out what it has, 7 tabs open, like including my Gmail and LinkedIn. A few of them are various LLMs, and that's exactly for that purpose of sort of forcing me to think, because it's a forced open tab of what else can I do with it. It's a really a forced way to experiment with the tool. You'd never understand the tool until you use it and then actually misuse it, and then you truly understand the tool and its limitation, and that's what it means to know the tool. I guess my last question is around, so what if we could sort of had a crystal ball, what will gen AI mean for the future of legal profession? How will it change? I'm not going to ask you for the better or worse, because that's a value judgment. Some people regret invention of will and electricity, so I'm not going to ask you that, but I will ask you, how will it be different?
I've got to say, I don't know. I really don't. The only thing I know is there will be a lot of change. I'm very confident there will be a lot of change. But I think that there are so many uncertainties that I want to be humble in my ability to say, well, this is what it's going to look like. And I think maybe by saying, look, I don't know what it's going to look like in 5 or 10 years, but I know it's going to be different. I but if I, some real possibilities, I think that there could be a lot of legal tasks that are fully automated. I think there could be really different structures in terms of how law firms operate, in terms of the ratio of associates to partners, in terms of the usage of non JD trained individuals who can use this technology. I think there's going to be a tremendous range of tools that continues to develop. I think that legal services will become more broadly available, and I think that people are going to need to adapt to change circumstances, because I don't think we've seen anything like this in a very long time in terms of something that's going to impact the practice of lawyering. And I think we're just at the beginning of it, just given how much change we've seen in the last couple of years and the rate at which the underlying technology is changing.
Yeah, I mean, I usually remind folks that right before Great Depression, we actually predicted the rise of the market, and we absolutely had no clue that pandemic is coming. So our ability to predict, and this is now pretty well documented, is essentially non-existent. So anyone's guess is as good as anyone else's. And yes, it is absolutely important to play with the tool so that whatever happens, you could be too proficient and help yourself and folks around you. Dan, this was a great conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. We've covered a lot of ground. What is one takeaway, if we can limit it to one, or one call to action that you can have for folks to make sure that they continue enjoying their legal practice, whether it's in house, at a law firm, government? What is the one takeaway you want folks to take from this conversation?
I would say the first thing is experiment for yourself and then read a literature that has data on the effect of this technology. And obviously, I have a bias and a self interest in pushing that because I've done some of that work. But I think that it's very easy to get caught up in narratives and to get whether it's the narrative that this is the next great thing, or it's the narrative that this is all hype. Like both narratives are out there, but there's some evidence out there too. And I think following that evidence and developing, thinking of yourself as a mini experimenter and thinking about what ways you can experiment with it yourself and your practice with with the way that you interact with lawyers, the way that you interact with clients is ultimately going to be the practice that best sets you up to enjoy the fruits of this new technology for lawyers.
I love it. Go play with some tech. Dan, thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, audience, for joining as well. I'll see you next time. Bye.
And that brings us to the end of another thrilling episode on the Notes to My Legal Self AI Insights. We had a fantastic time exploring the fascinating intersection of law and AI with you. But hold on tight, because the adventure doesn't stop here. Stay connected with us on social media to continue the conversation, share your thoughts, and be part of our incredible community of legal enthusiasts. Together, we can inspire, learn, and make a real impact on the world of law and AI. If you enjoyed today's episode, we encourage you to share it with your friends, colleagues, and anyone else who could benefit from the exciting insights we discussed. Let's spread the knowledge and enthusiasm far and wide.